Welcome to today's USB and Pharmatech webinar, the basis of PCM control strategy, material characterization. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. Next. Each registration is unique and grants the right for the individual registrant only to view this webinar. Sharing this webinar with unregistered viewers, either during or after its performance, violates Pharmatech Associates copyright and it is prohibited. Next. If you have not already done so, we ask that you take some time to read the Pharmatech Associates course disclaimer. You can download this presentation, including the disclaimer, from your USB education account. Please follow the instructions in your confirmation email to download the presentation. Next. Presenting today is Richard Steiner, Practice Lead at Pharmatech Associates, and Atul Duvey, Senior Principal Scientist at USB. Welcome both.
Yeah, and welcome to everyone out there. So I'm pleased to have my colleague Atul Dubey from USP with me today. Hello, Atul.
Hello, Richard.
A little sound check for the beginning. And Atul is expert in continuous manufacturing, supply chain resilience, and myself. We are very excited to have this webinar together for you, and we talk about control strategy and what this has to do with material characterization. Let me start with some basics. Of course, we know batch processing. We know that unit operations in a batch process are interrupted. So you have intermediates which are carried from one to the other unit operation. And whether this is an OSD product or a liquid product, an API, you have quality checks in between. And so that's clear. Then oftenly asked, what is the difference to continuous manufacturing? Here you have basically the same unit operations, but they work one in the other and together. So you couldn't say that each of these unit operations is a highly sophisticated operation and process. I want to compare to a musician in a big symphonic orchestra. And this has to be orchestrated, of course. And for this, you need a conductor. Which some may say, okay, that's an automation system on top of your unit operations. But yeah, where's actually the control strategy living? And the control strategy in this picture is basically the sheet notes and the sheet music, which describes what is intended to play. But we all know, and it's particularly those who have implemented continuous processes in real life, that it is quite an art. And to conduct such an orchestra needs a lot of knowledge and understanding in between. And this is what we want to talk about today, Atul and myself. But yeah, Atul, let's start with some basics for our audience.
Before we do, I like the musical analogy there, and I can see you're a musical person. You said a couple of words which got me thinking. You said it's highly sophisticated unit operations and it is complex, but that does not always mean it's difficult, and the level of complexity is higher than a batch process, because I see batch mixing, there is a level of complexity there in powder mixing, but I don't think that continuous mixing is that much more complex or difficult than batch mixing, right?
Okay, yep.
Sure. So yeah, control strategy is a very, very important topic. In fact, we have published a technical guide last year on control strategy, which has been downloaded in over 40 countries now. There are, as you can see in this beautiful pyramid, there are 3 levels of control strategies. We're starting with the very basic one and leading up to the higher levels where you have real-time automatic process controls built in. And I think most processes lie somewhere in between by borrowing concepts from level 2 and level 1. And you don't want to be testing your end product as the sole indicator of quality. So you want to be higher than the level 3. Control strategy was defined in ICH Q8 revision 2, and there's a very nice definition there, and it says that ultimately you're looking to control your product quality and all the steps that you take in between to ensure that quality, all the process analytical tools you may use, all the operational considerations that go with it are all included as a part of a control strategy.
And I think what is also here interesting to see the considerations for control strategy. One of the major topics listed by this FDA slide is the characterization of the incoming materials. So there's a clear indication that it has a lot to do with the material which goes in to the process and the variations of this, why we talk about material characterization.
Indeed.
So let's go to the next slide and give maybe Abdul give some perspective how you would see this material attributes element in the overall schematics of a control strategy, please.
In ICHQ 13, we define a control strategy as containing 4 major elements, and material attributes is one of the most prominent ones in that. The other elements, as you can see in the first picture here, is the process monitoring and control, operational procedures. For example, how do you schedule your operations, whether you have intermediate bulk containers sitting, are you using them, how much you're using them, and so on and so forth. And then the equipment operation and system integration, how everything is integrated, the control systems and the manufacturing equipment and so on. But material attributes are the first step. If we don't get them right, then everything else is very, very difficult. So I believe it's very important to understand the properties of the incoming materials in the process. And one way you do it is, as you see in the picture on the right, you list out all variables that can impact the processing of this material. And we'll see some of this in the later slides also. You list them out and you kind of create a fishbone or Ishikawa diagram saying that, okay, these are the things that are going to impact my process. Then after risk analysis, using prior knowledge, etc., you can rank them and say, okay, these are most important variables. Once they are linked and ranked, you can go for a design of experiments and understand the interplay between them and their impact. And that eventually leads to this enhanced process understanding and development of a control strategy.
What I find interesting on this chart as well is also the operational procedures around the control strategy. I mean, we want to focus on material attributes, of course, but I found this also pretty interesting because I think some would maybe forget about this point easily. Yeah. Okay, let's have a view to a little chessboard and to give also some perspective to why I mentioned complexity earlier in the start of this webinar. Very simplistic, you have material handling, you have dosing, blending, and some would say mixing, dosing, mixing. You have a granulation layer, mostly in these units, whether this is a wet granulation, dry granulation, melt granulation process. You have then usually another dosing, blending, or mixing into operation before you go to tablet compression and finally to film coating. So you see the material in between these unit operations is changing, of course, its state, and the intermediates between these unit operations are not simply what is the inbound material structure anymore. So if you design such a system, of course, you have to have the mechanical interfaces designed in a way that these intermediates can be transferred flawlessly from one to the other unit operation. I used to say that this is sometimes a process in its own right, because in some cases you see, for example, pneumatic conveying, dense phase conveying, or any kind of means transporting these intermediates from one unit operation to the other. Of course, ideally, this would be built in so close to one another that you have hardly any interference. But in reality, as we will see on a few pictures, of course, there are mechanical distances to go. And this makes it sometimes very, let's say, challenging for the design and the layout. And then last but not least, you have the control. So you have basically 4 interfaces to manage and to keep on watching. Even if you study just the material characterizations and the challenges which of each of these unit operations, you need to look to the bigger picture if you integrate all these unit operations together. Then you have your PET tools on board. At the beginning, of course, material identification. You have blend uniformity measures, and these usually are PET instrumentations which are in between these unit operations, because I think a high level schematic is always saying only good material goes from one unit operation to the next. Only what is in spec and in line. So these unit operation interfaces, they not just simply are housing the PET, the inline PET, they also usually take, there's positions for taking samples. And yeah, this segregate material if something is out of spec. This goes down all the way until you are basically in the space of then content uniformity measure, or last but not least, even then appearance tests and checks for the finished tablet, which you can nowadays also find already some PET tools available. So yeah, if you see this whole map, then you can understand where is the challenge and why it is so important to characterize the material, not only the inbound material, but also all the way it goes down to the finished product. Let's go to the next chart. Yeah, so Atul, I think you also have seen those in the real life. Did you?
Yes, so both extremely well maintained and well designed configurations in both famous lines.
Yeah, they're kind of lighthouse installations in the market, if you will. And I think why we've put these both photos into the slide deck is, of course, to give some more idea for those who haven't seen systems like that. So this is exactly what I showed on the chessboard before. Now you can see it in a bit more real life, and you can also then understand why sometimes also dimensions or if you have multi-level installations, for example, can provide some challenges.
Yeah, two things strike always when I look at these is that the space savings, how much smaller the whole manufacturing line is. And second, that you can see some unit operations that are still in batch, and it is perfectly fine to have batch unit operations like drying.
Mm. Yeah, we talk about this kind of, it's getting also more and more prominently discussed, this mini batch processing basically. And here, if you look to fluid bed dryer or so, you usually have buckets of material and you can define them as mini batch. And this is basically leads to my next chart. So continuous flow or continuous manufacturing does not necessarily always mean you have a continuous flow regime. So in particular in material handling or in the inbound section, you have sometimes mini batch processing or buckets of material who are going in. So you have a discrete flow and the plug flow principle. Then dosing blending in the most of cases nowadays is a loss in weight feeding and a continuous dry blender. So there you have a real continuous flow regime. On wet granulation, as just highlighted for the, in particular for the fluid bed drying, you have segments and you have again discrete flows, and then you consolidate discrete flows into the next level before you go to the tableting machine. So you see a mix, and so that's a prominent question, Atul, saying, oh, is it possible actually to mix this in a hybrid control strategy, or what is the suggestion in your point?
I think the definition of continuous manufacturing that was put together in ICHQ 13 was that you have to have two unit operations connected together that work in a continuous mode. And outside of those, you can have any number of unit operations that may be batch or continuous. It is still considered a continuous manufacturing process. So this all depends on the convenience and the ability to handle that material. So if you need to use batch unit operations, it is completely acceptable here. I see some PFR and CSTRs in here, and it reminds me of my early days in graduate school. For those who don't know, PFR is a plugged flow reactor where you assume the entire set of material moves together through the process, while a CSTR is a continuous stirred tank reactor where material is coming in, it is getting stirred. In a case of a reaction, there two reactants get to see each other as the material is stirred, and then it exits out of the reactor.
And thanks for this reference, because this leads to the next slide as well. So if you have a continuous flow regime, I think it's very common nowadays to use residence time distribution models to predict or to work as a predictive model. And I think there you also have been working on a guideline for this kind of technology, right?
Yes, indeed. We recently published a technical guide on materials characterization as well as on models, process models, with RTD taking the center stage, of course. And we've also published two or three peer-reviewed articles on RTD in collaboration with Rutgers University.
Mm-hmm.
This was actually defined by Danckwerts back in the 50s when he was looking at reactors. And that is how whole theory came about. And now we use it for powders, for mixing, for
Mm-hmm.
feeding, and for entire processes. It's wonderful.
Nice. So I myself saw this the first time in the late 90s and early 2000s on melt granulation process, on the twin screw melt granulation process, where we also used exactly the same models to predict the residence time distribution in a twin screw. So it's a very common way of used to in the continuous industry. Yeah. So you
So,
can, of course, then define what happens if you have a spike, if anything is, let's say, out of control, to what extent this really hits um, the point where material at end of the line is getting out of spec, and then you can segregate.
so essentially, for those who are seeing this for the first time, I would say that to characterize residence time distribution, essentially we put a tracer in the beginning of the process, and then we look at how the tracer spreads
Mm-hmm.
out during the processing and how it comes out in the output of that process, how it is distributed. So what we see here is that um, there was a feeder and then there was a downstream unit operation like a mixer. And there was a spike. The gray spike I see on the left is the concentration of the API that suddenly spiked. And it could happen because of any reason. Somebody stepped near the feeder, something fell that created a vibration, or there was a bearding or some issues. And that spike, how it propagates in the downstream, and if it is big enough that somebody needs to divert material out in the running process or not. So those are the decisions that are made on the fly, and there are guidelines and guardrails around them. that I guess defines in the design space.
We will talk about also the effect of the material of all of this, of course. Yeah. So let's have a deeper dive into the critical quality process and material attributes, Atul. So you have put this chart together. So please walk us through to that.
Yeah, the thinking here is to look at the unit operations and the process in a simplified manner while focusing on the critical attributes. And we see these definitions, these acronyms coming out again and again. So it's important that we know where these are most relevant. So a process designer must look at the target product profile first. That essentially defines what a patient is going to see on the label that they buy. And working backwards from there, one can define a critical quality attribute for a drug product. And some examples, as we show here, are potency, efficacy, and bioavailability. Um, how to achieve those critical quality attributes? You look at the critical process parameters. Now, there are many, many process parameters possible, but not all of them may be critical to the process. So identifying critical process parameters is key. Otherwise, we end up doing a lot of experiments for nothing, and that leads to a lot of wastage. So understanding the process and defining those critical process parameters is important. Regulatory agencies also look for that. Understanding them for each of your unit operations. And then you look at how the critical material attributes, whichever material attributes may be the most important and critical here, are influenced as the process goes through, and how they eventually the interaction between the CMAs and CPPs results into my CQAs. We've also provided some examples of critical material attributes in the powder-based processes here, like particle size, its distribution, density, etc.
But these are all things which you can nicely characterize, and we will touch on this, how to do that. Yeah, we'll have some deeper dive into some equipment
Yeah.
examples as well.
Earlier we were talking about Ishikawa diagram, if you remember.
Yeah.
That you list out all the possible sources of variation that could pose a challenge to you. And this is an example of that. In each of the unit operations listed here, feeding, milling, blending, tableting, there can be different failure modes. The feeder may have flow rate variability, which is outside of my specs or design space. There can be issues with cohesion during the milling, and the same issues can impact my blending, and then finally tableting. So what material properties may be most relevant are also listed out in a table like that, and you can see them here. And then what characterization techniques are used for that. For many of these techniques, USP actually has several general chapters, for example, for shear cell methodology, for measuring powder density, etc. And in fact, we are developing a very important general chapter on measurement of electrostatics, which is a big factor in continuous as well as batch manufacturing processes. So like I was saying earlier, you have all of these parameters and failure modes, and then you have to rank them and list them, and you can put them together here and say, these are my CQAs I identified: appearance, assay, content uniformity, etc. These are the unit operations that impact it, and then I can also rank the impact as high, medium, or low, or no impact, and color them accordingly, and that clearly shows which ones I want to focus on the most. And this is an important technique often used also by regulatory agencies.
I think this is a very nice, let's say, guideline for those who will go the first time in such a venture. And I think even if we say, okay, it's easy as possible, but it is some work to do. And for those who are going this the first time, of course, this is some challenge we have to confess. Yeah. So now let's talk about quickly a bit of equipment. So you see here in this overview a few of the well-known feeder brands. And loss in weight feeders in this kind of setup are very important, not only because of the material has to get through to them, so the material needs to be capable and willingness to get fed by a screw and uh, by such a device, but also in the overall control regime, we have to say basically the loss in weight feeder is something like the heartbeat of such a Conti system. Yeah, so it is going back to my conductor example. Um, when you have a loss in weight feeder in a control strategy is a bit like a master, and all the other unit operations are following this as a servant. Yeah, so you have to understand this device very much. And I also not getting tired to mention that the loss in weight feeder is a great PET tool. Yeah, would you agree to that as well?
Indeed, what I'm seeing here is that you have a hopper, you fill in material in there. Under that, you have a horizontal screw that rotates and kind of conveys this material out. And I can imagine if I have dry salt, nice and granular, small particle size, it will be easy to put it through. But on a very humid day, the salt doesn't really want to flow, and it may not want to come out even if I rotate my screw.
Mhm.
So I guess that analogy applies to pharmaceutical materials a lot.
Yeah, and this is very interesting what you're saying. So this makes now clear why also the room conditions and everything around the system is critical for the control strategy too. Because again, if you say you do not have the environment controlled well enough, of course, this changes with the weather. You can see problems, and I saw this also with my own eyes. Yeah, if you are not diligently control the humidity or something like that, it can cause effects on your process, and you may wonder why you see these effects to certain times in the year. Yeah. So and here this is just some examples. We will see some more disastrous examples a little bit later as well. But so yeah, fishbone diagram has been mentioned multiple times, and this is how it could look like. I just wanted to highlight the material section. And which of those would you say, Abdul, from your experience, are the most challenging or the most important,
Um,
if any to highlight?
Now, all of them are important for sure, but measurement of density and sizes is well established.
Mm,
There are great tools available to do that. And like I said, guidance from USP is also available. Um, but the more challenging ones are cohesion and adhesion to the walls
mhm,
that can make or break a process. And then electrostatics, which is
mm,
another player that can lead to what you just called as a disastrous feeding process.
mm,
So understanding the material and the behavior around this,
mhm,
how the environment impacts these parameters, and if one can do something beforehand, like pre-mixing or silication,
mm,
that can help with this, is important.
mm. And it's another nice case of what I earlier mentioned. If you just see a feeder isolated, these are the challenges. But what I think is important to also give to the audience here, to the participants, is do not underestimate if you put, let's say, blender and feeder together and you have some airflow through to these systems. Do not underestimate also these connections between the systems and what this can have an impact on one and the other. And just to name a few. But for those who haven't really analyzed a loss in weight feeding process, just to uh, for educational background. So loss in weight feeder means you have a gravimetric mode section where you have weighing balances, these weighing balances measuring the loss of weight in the hopper over the time. And then you have what is called a volumetric mode. And this is most of concern of everyone saying, oh, because when you refill, you basically, the screw speed is set fixed for this moment, and this interfill refill interruption is of course important to know the effect of it. For some solutions, this can be longer. For some other technical solutions, it can be shorter. So I think the optimization, again, the orchestration, the conductor managing this is important. Yeah, that you have a very, let's say, most concise possible way of an output, particularly when it comes to very, very low volume feeding the feed rates. Yeah, here you can see basically on the top volumetric rate. So you have to keep in mind when you run in a volumetric mode, of course, the flow rate goes down with the level of the hopper and the pressure of the material load on top of the screw. Whereas if you have a constant gravimetric flow rate, usually the speed of the screw is changing, your feed factor is changing, adapting to the weight of the material in the hopper, and then you can see it's a much more constant output. Still variations because you have noise, and this noise needs to be studied as well.
This brings me to the point you mentioned earlier that feeder is a great PAT tool to begin with. And sometimes we think of PAT, we think of spectroscopic PAT only. But here it's so simple. The feeder has a very sensitive scale on which the hopper sits and the material sits. It can regulate the speed of the screw based on how much material is on it because it senses this weight several times in a second and sends it to the computer, right?
This is the control scheme in a high level. Yeah, everybody can see this, and where physics plays in. Yeah, exactly what you are saying. You have the load cell who is measuring basically the weight, and then the change over time. So this is the relation to the bulk density. This is why these devices they're really sensitive enough to identify changes in the density to an extent that you even can see sometimes if the bulk density is changing from inbound material. Let's say you have just another bulk of material coming in who maybe set longer or is a different batch, and you can see these changes sometimes, and this is why I would call them a PET tool. Yeah? Then you have the mass flow filter, which controls the feed factor, and then the PET controller, basically the speed of the screw. So this is just to give you an idea about the feed control. And I think this is one of the few built-in feedback loops you can see on continuous manufacturing today already
So
existing.
essentially, I cannot just pick a scoop of powder and put it in a running process and say, "Oh, it's all good." The controller is not going to like that. I see.
Yeah, you have to also here when it comes to feed factor, and this is another thing beside the material characterization, and you can test, of course, with these feeders your materials, and I think most, if not all, those companies who have continuous manufacturing nowadays in place, they will have a loss in weight feeder somewhere in their lab studying the products continuously, and but they also study these feeding devices because they are from different brands, so you have different designs, of course, but also it's important to say that the feed factor is not always defined in the same way. So you have to understand how your feeder is working, and the feeding principles of each of these feeders, and this is also a part of the filing later. Yeah?
So when in my graduate school days, we were looking at very small scale lab batch blenders like a V blender, and then looking at the scale up into a pilot scale or even to a manufacturing scale, we would need to consider these factors like the increased amount of powder that's there in the bigger blenders and the movement of that.
Mm.
While here, I see that your actual manufacturing feeder could be the one that you can put in your lab for analysis. So that's a huge advantage that you don't need to physically worry
It's
about the
true.
scale up.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. because you do the same, you use the same device, and so the mechanical and the process is equal, so it's easier to transfer. Yeah? And here you have a couple of examples. Of course, there's a huge variation with every vendor on different screw profiles, and this also shows clearly sometimes the knowledge base of these vendors for this kind of devices. And I would say at least most of the materials I know, you can get them somehow through to this system, but it can be, or it is necessary to test. And it's not just this, the feed rate, it's everything around it because of cohesion, adhesion. You mentioned the make of the manufacturing quality of these elements is important, not just for cleaning purpose, but also for being precise and consistent in quality, yeah, for the end product. So yeah, loss and weight feeder, again, heartbeat of any system. And then you can define your design space accordingly. So you see here the effect on the feed factors for different screw profiles. Anything to add to this before I go further? Then, of course, you find in literature also ways how to do this, how to study, how to set up your DOE work around these feeders. I think there's enough experience in this field because loss in weight feeding technology is around since many more years than pharmaceutical manufacturing uh, got the first time continuous loss in weight feeders in their labs. Yeah, filtering of data. I think that's also something which is of interest because every of these before mentioned feeder suppliers use all different filter um, uh, technologies or filter arithmetics, and you have to study that to understand the fluctuations of your feed rate, if this is through to the fill of the system, if this is maybe by disturbances through to the refilling, or even maybe through to outside effects.
Yeah, I can see. I saw a number of different screw designs in the previous slides. I can imagine that when those screws are rotating, they would have a natural sinusoidal variation a little bit in the particle flow rate or material flow rate.
Mhm.
And relative to my dosage form size, maybe that is not important. And maybe my next unit operation will be able to easily handle that variation.
Mm.
And I guess that kind of averaging is important, that you don't worry about things that are not
Mm.
going to impact the product quality.
And yeah, this then, let's say, goes also into the refilling. I think the refilling, as shown earlier, you want to make sure that the volumetric part, so the interruption of your gravimetric part of the loss in fading is not interrupted too long. But of course, you have to design it also with the capacity these devices have to deliver. So you find consequently also different solutions for that, and you have to study, you have to see whether this is a rotary cell or this is a bucket who is refilling quickly, or there's maybe another volumetric but bigger dosing system on top who is refilling the feeder. The volumes of each of these sections, the hopper volume corresponding to the throughput capacities. These are all things you have to study, and they're all highly dependent on the materials as well. Even the form and the design of these hoppers in some cases are important and different from product to product. And then you study the deviations. You just want to make sure that whatever you can see as effect is not dramatically changing the performance of the loss and weight feeder.
Yes, this reminds me. One of my good friends, he actually used this topic as one of his dissertation, PhD dissertation topics, and he did a deep study on the impact of refill on feeder performance. But also to put in context, a process could have 2 to 5 different ingredients being fed in with multiple feeders. So each one of them may need a different type of refill mechanism.
Mhm.
Some materials you use very little of, some materials you use in bulk.
Mhm.
So it is important to know how it fits into your overall supply chain, overall manufacturing execution system, that you install these things, how you refill them, how many
Mhm.
bags come in, from where they are coming
Mhm.
in, and all of those things,
Yeah.
because that eventually impacts the feeder performance.
No, I mean, I even saw control strategies in reality where you do not have automatic material handling and refilling at all. So you just do the batch with one filled hopper, basically, or maybe one bin. If you have a small batch size and a very low dose product, this might be sufficient, and you don't need necessarily an automated refilling. Yeah. Let's go to the next step. Which is the blending or mixing devices. And then here you see basically two groups nowadays. You have the mini batch blender. On the left side, you see the Gerica and the Syntegon. They're companies who providing this kind of technology. But by the way, this is not comprehensive. There might be more. It's just um, so from my collection of experience. You have then the typical screw blenders. Either they are horizontal or with angle decline. But this is principally the two things you might find. And yeah, if you have a mini batch blending or this kind of tool, of course, we talked about earlier, then you have a combination in your control strategy, a hybrid setup, um, or you have a continuous flow blender. Let's pick on this a little bit. What do you think of all of these main mechanisms for mixing are the most important in your point of
So
view?
what we see here is a horizontal impeller based blender, wherein two powders come in from one end on the top. The impeller blades rotate, and then they throw the material around and sometimes fluidize it, and that gives this opportunity to this material to mix. So we can see convection by the impeller action. The blades are throwing the material around, so that is being convected towards the outlet. There is dispersion, as in the material randomly moves around. And then I think the most important is also the shear.
Hmm.
Sometimes we miss that the impeller blades are going through the material, so there are shear forces acting on the material, which allow the material particles to rub against each other, or layers to rub against each other. And sometimes if we have um, materials like magnesium stearate for lubrication, uh, amount of shear that we impart to the material is extremely
Hmm.
important to know, because over lubrication is a challenge, and it can make your granules or tablets hydrophobic in the end. That can lead to dissolution challenges. Also,
And
too much shear can lead to deagglomeration. Yes.
how you study that? How you study this kind of effect?
Um, Primarily, there is no way around doing some experimentation. You have to learn how the equipment behaves, how the material behaves in it. But there are also modeling tools that one can deploy that can reduce the number of experiments you need to do.
Mm.
And modeling tools can be mechanistic, like what we see here is a discrete element model where two simple powders are put together and impellers rotate. And there is a lot of mathematical partial differential equations solved at every step. I used to do this research a
Yes, I
while
saw
ago.
your name. I saw your name on that.
Ah,
This,
okay.
this, is- this is why I showed it.
Yeah. So one can look at the impact of the design. For example, if you have a weir in the end, if you're stopping the material outflow so that it gets more chance to backflow into this mixer and get more chances to mix, then you can characterize this by the number of blade passes a typical piece of material may feel,
Mm, mm,
impact of rotating the blades, at 80 RPM versus 250 RPM and so on. So I guess there are modeling tools that are there.
Absolutely. And here again, another fishbone. And let's look again here to the material attributes. You say shear sensitivity earlier. So this is why it is also shown on this fishbone, I assume. Yeah.
Yes, that and like any propensity to agglomerate on its own, or hydrophobicity, and there are some other characteristics like that.
Okay, if you in a nutshell summarize what a blender is there for, it's of course mixing, blending, but also I think to remove imperfections as a low pass filter, basically to the loss in rate feeder. And I think if you optimize such a process, you look, of course, for the lowest possible RSD residence RSD within a minimum hold-up mass. Hold-up mass is also such a word which you hear oftenly if you characterize a blender. So this hold-up mass, tell us a little bit. Is this dependent on the material?
It does, and it also depends on how fast you rotate your blades. It depends on the design, if you have a veer or a stopper, or if you tilt your blender upwards. That is also done to create a certain level of mass holdup.
So you can, of course, you need to study the impeller speed, blade configuration to find out what is the right setup for your product, and then you create basically this kind of overviews for materials. You see here a couple of materials mentioned, and this is what you study basically in your material characterization and the equipment characterization part of your work.
Yes, you can create these kinds of maps, and that make it easy to see what would happen if my blade speed kept going up. For example, if the demand goes up and I really need to produce more, can I just spin them faster and produce more material? So it's important to know what can happen if I do that, or if I increase or decrease my flow rate, depending on my output needs, what may happen, and so on and so forth.
We have these nice pictures here about disasters which can happen, and yeah, I think it's of course one is forming rat holes, or the other one is bearding. These are very prominent cases, and I think this is what a lot of people are concerned. Yeah. So to what extent do you think equipment design and the setup is important to tackle those problems?
Yeah, but I also want to mention that these may be extreme cases and designed to look like that, not to scare anybody into thinking that using a continuous mixer is going to give me this, and I have to figure out ways to take care of that. No, it's not the case. But these do show that what could happen if we do not understand our material, if you do not understand what the screw is going to do to my material. And if I do understand that, I can take steps prior to putting it into the feeder that will help me mitigate these risks.
Mhm.
So rat holing is essentially the screw is rotating, the material is sticking around, there's nothing flowing out. While bearding, material does flow out very well, but right at the exit, because of electrostatics, it is sticking to each other, sticking to the outlet of the feeder, and is creating these large chunks like frozen snow. And then when they become big enough, they could suddenly fall and they would go into the next step, usually a blender, and that would create a spike. Now, if the blender is well designed and these avalanches are small enough, the blender may be able to take care of that.
Mm.
So it may not really be a problem, but it's good to know and understand this a priori.
Of course, you have to take action here that this kind of accumulations are not happening, in particular if you have low dose applications. Yeah. And yeah, here's another example for how to study a combination of feeder and blender in interaction. Yeah, you set up this test rig, you give a pulse, you study the result of this, and
Yeah.
yeah, you create basically
Concentration profiles of
yeah.
API using PAT. Yeah, the easiest way I can think of doing this is that if I have a running feeder and a mixer, I take a hammer and I bang that feeder, and the feeder is going to just create a big pulse.
Yeah, but it's this is nice what you're saying, because in some cases um, you can even see on the feeder the disturbance if somebody closes the doors, yeah,
Yes.
in the room. And then so you have again the effect also on the feeder to the room, vice versa. So you have to not just consider the design of the equipment, but you also have to consider very much the place where you put this equipment in. It's highly sensitive. Even vibrations can have an effect. Yeah, so I think in the being conscious also about time, um, we walked through a little bit to one of the most important elements of a Conti system. This is always this dosing blending section. Of course, there is more, but I hope that this already gives an impression about the importance, how to study your material on the way through these unit operations. And then if you go to quality by design, PET and RTRT applications, it gets even more important. You have to have inline PET tools. I saw already somewhere a question about the control, where is the QC testing happening in a process like this. Of course, if you take samples, you can do some QC testing offline, but the material goes quickly through. Yeah, so this is why I think inline PET sensors are very crucial and important for any kind of a control strategy for continuous process. Just highlighting here very prominent ones like blend uniformity or moisture measurement, and respectively the PET technologies for those applications, and what kind of critical quality attributes are impacted and measured with this. I want to show this again and also show how it could look like if you have a very complex solution between as an interface, and why this can become an own machine if you have PET tools. So having said that there are opportunities in PET, I think nowadays you also have to be very mindful to which extent you employ this kind of PET sensors in your commercial system. I think in a development rig, it's one part to understand your process, to develop the process control strategy. But if you go to a commercial setting, it is also about the reliability of these tools and interfaces. And this is where predictive models nowadays are coming very much into the picture.
Yes, and I think in the lab scale, when we are developing the process, you have the luxury to take samples out and analyze them in the traditional way. And that's a good starting point that can lead us to understanding how much PAT we need in the real process. Because there are expenses associated with it. There are chemometric models that need to be maintained. There are sensors that need to be replaced or cleaned. So those are challenges. And I think the powder-based continuous manufacturing of drug products is now fairly mature. It's not even considered as an emerging technology by the FDA anymore. So you have a clearer understanding now that how much PAT you need in the end. But in other processes like biologics and drug substance, you may need orthogonal testing. So you want to test in multiple ways sometimes there.
Again, you talked about the reliability, the challenges, but also the reliability aspect is important if you design these interfaces, and this together makes the music. I want to go as the outro. We are already at 5 minutes Q&A time only, but this is the final slide, I promise. So in the outro, I want to get back to the first slide where you have these unit operations working into one and another. I think the SCADA system basically takes over as the conductor. This is why I also see some companies name their products after this. And then you have these PAT tools and PAT management system. So that's quite a structure around your whole entire continuous manufacturing process. And I think this should give us a nice understanding how big such an orchestra can become over time. And I think as this is the last slide and we have really a couple of questions here, I would like to conclude and open the floor to answer the questions. Okay, here it is on the side. Can you see, Atul, the questions as well?
I am trying to figure out how to find it.
Could you advance to the next slide?
How about that?
There we go.
Okay, good. Okay, Atul, take the first.
I don't think we leave QC testing out of control strategy. We assume that the testing has been done to sufficiently evaluate the process analytical tools that are being used to qualify them, their usage. And those tools are the ones that are telling in real time the state of the quality of the process. So, and it's not that you can run 24/7, 365 and just blindly trust the models and methods that you've put in. You still want to take time out and still want to go back and check from time to time in the traditional ways.
What are the first steps to take to move from batch to continuous? I think one of the first steps I would have in mind is get your products, your materials you used to have on your batch process, take them to the loss and wait feeder. Just try to see how the loss and wait feeder can deal with this kind of material in the first place. If you get through to that, you will get it through to the rest of the equipment as well.
I think even the step even before that is to come to webinars like these to get a first sense of what this is about. And we also have a continuous manufacturing knowledge center, which is also free to use and participate. And several experts answer questions over there. It's a growing community. So, and then there's conferences and other meetings that happen from time to time. I think going there and trying to understand how others are doing it is the first step to starting the learning process.
And also, of course, you can reach out to experts like us. Yeah. And the other question, I think we have answered the top one. The next question is raw material suppliers are offering now tailor-made products. What is the benefit that comes with those products? I think what I see so far is that a big part of this is having easier flowable material. Yeah. So that's maybe one of the benefits. It can be co-processed products, not limited to that, but this is what I see. I think if you develop a new recipe, it's really worthwhile looking into this new kind of raw materials, which might help you to skip typical other excipients you have seen so far in your recipes.
Yeah, and that relates to also supply chain resilience. At USP, we think a lot about supply chains, about what materials are available in what parts of the world. And sometimes these kinds of materials and suppliers, if they are near you, that can change the economics of manufacturing.
I think that the other question here is also very important. Companies redefine the specific recipes. If so, how? I think is of course first of all not just testing if it works, but it's also a question of the business case, yeah, for those products and whether these are filed products and yeah, what is the business case around the implementation? Yeah.
Yes, and there is definitely going to be regulatory scrutiny if you are
Mm.
changing your process from batch into continuous. So sometimes people think that if this we are going to go through that level of analysis of process development, might as well use different materials now, so which make it easier for us to work with,
Mm.
because eventually we have to justify the use of the
Mm.
new materials.